The October my life fell apart. I was standing in a Shoppers Drug Mart in Winnipeg at 11 p.m., trying to decide between two brands of infant formula while my phone buzzed with a message I didn't have the courage to open. His name was in the notification preview. That was enough. I'd been doing that for weeks, reading just the first line, then locking the screen, telling myself I'd deal with it later, when I was stronger, when my daughter was sleeping through the night, when I had something resembling a plan. But there in the fluorescent-lit pharmacy aisle, with a 6-month-old strapped to my chest and exactly $43 in my checking account until Friday, I understood that later had run out. My name is irrelevant to this story. What matters is that I was 29 years old, a former middle school teacher, and I had just driven 14 hours from Halifax to leave behind the man who had systematically dismantled every good thing about me over the course of 3 years. I was heading to Winnipeg because that's where my best friend lived, the one who'd known me since we were 7, the one who'd sent me an email 6 weeks earlier that just said, "Come, whenever. The door is open." His name is Patrick. I met him in 2nd grade. He moved into the house 2 doors down from mine in a quiet suburb outside Ottawa, showed up on the first day of school wearing a Maple Leaf jersey in a neighborhood that was deeply, aggressively devoted to the Senators, and somehow charmed everyone within a week anyway. That was Patrick. That had always been Patrick. By the time we were adults, he was running his own engineering consulting firm in Winnipeg. The kind of slow, steady success that looked effortless from the outside because he'd never once made it about showing off. He drove a 10-year-old truck. He called his mother every Sunday. He remembered without being reminded that I took my coffee with oat milk and exactly 1 sugar. When my marriage started crumbling, really crumbling, not just the normal friction of 2 people trying to share a bathroom and a bank account, Patrick was the first person I called. Not my sister, not my mother. Him. He had said, back then, "He doesn't deserve you." He never did. I thought he was just being a good friend. I didn't move in on his doorstep all at once. That's not how these things happen. I drove into Winnipeg on a Tuesday evening in October, my hatchback packed with everything I'd been able to grab, while my ex-husband was at work, Maeve's clothes, her bouncy seat, my laptop, 2 boxes of teaching resources I couldn't bring myself to leave behind. I'd called Patrick from a rest stop outside Portage La Prairie, voice completely even, which is how you know someone is about to completely fall apart. He said he'd leave the building entrance unlocked. His condo was on the 8th floor. He'd made the pull-out sofa up with the good sheets. When I knocked on his door, he opened it before I could finish knocking. He looked at me, at Maeve, in the carrier, at the duffel bag over my shoulder, at whatever was happening on my face, and he didn't say anything about how long the drive must have been, or ask if I was okay. He just took the bag and stepped back. "You're here," he said. That was all. That was enough. The first few days were strange in the way that only safety can be strange when you've forgotten what it feels like. I woke up every morning not entirely sure where I was. Maeve did what 6-month-olds do. She was loud and unpredictable and completely indifferent to the chaos she'd been born into. And Patrick moved around her like he'd always been doing this, like there had always been an infant bouncy seat in his living room, and formula in his cupboard, and a baby monitor crackling softly on his kitchen counter. He worked from home 3 days a week. On those mornings, I'd come out and find him already at his desk, coffee made, the kind of quiet industry that never made me feel like a disruption. "You didn't have to get up early," I told him once. "I didn't," he said. "I always start at 7. I didn't know that. I realized there were a lot of things about his daily life I didn't know, because I'd spent 3 years only calling when things were bad. He never once mentioned it. I got a call from the school board in Halifax about a week after I arrived. My principal, kind, apologetic, deeply uncomfortable, explained that my position had been filled by a long-term occasional teacher when I'd left without notice mid-semester. She was sorry. She hoped I was doing well. She didn't ask questions. I sat on Patrick's balcony for a long time after that call, looking out at the city. Winnipeg's not the kind of skyline that takes your breath away, but there's something honest about it. Flat and wide and not pretending to be anything it isn't. Patrick came out with 2 mugs of tea and sat down beside me without asking what the call had been about. I told him anyway. "My references are gone," I said. I left mid-semester. No school board is going to touch me. He was quiet for a moment. There's an online curriculum development company I consult for sometimes. They've been trying to expand their junior high literacy program. I mentioned your name a few weeks ago. They want to meet. I turned to look at him. You mentioned my name weeks ago? When you first called from Halifax. He wrapped both hands around his mug. I thought you'd need options. That was the moment I started understanding that what Patrick did for me was never reactive. He didn't scramble to fix things after the fact. He'd been quietly building scaffolding for weeks, just in case I needed somewhere to land. I wanted to argue. I had too much pride and too much shame to just accept it gracefully. But Maeve chose that moment to wake up from her nap with a level of urgency that made further conversation impossible. By the time she was fed and settled again, the argument I'd been composing had dissolved. I just looked at him and said, "Thank you." He said, "Don't." The interview happened 2 weeks later. I did it from Patrick's home office, Maeve in the next room with a playlist of those ridiculous infant music videos she loved. I wore a blazer on top and yoga pants on the bottom, which felt like an accurate representation of my life at that point. The company was based in Vancouver, but fully remote. They asked me about my teaching philosophy, about differentiated instruction, about how I'd approach curriculum design for students who'd been flagged as disengaged. I talked for 2 hours. When it was over, I felt, for the first time in months, like myself. They offered me the position 3 days later. I sat at Patrick's kitchen table and read the email 3 times before I said anything out loud. The salary wasn't what I'd been making as a full-time teacher, but it was close, and it was real, and I had done it myself. Patrick came in from his run, red-cheeked from the November cold, and I showed him my phone. He read it. Then he looked at me. Then he grinned. That same grin from when we were kids and he'd just done something he was genuinely proud of, and said, "Obviously." "You made one call," I said. "I made one call," he agreed. "The rest was you." I thought about my ex-husband a lot in those first weeks, not with longing. I want to be clear about that, but with a kind of incredulous exhaustion, the way you feel when you're finally out of a cold building and you realize how numb you'd gotten. His name was Graham. We'd met when I was 25, been together 4 years, married for 1. He was charming in the way that people who are good at impressions are charming. He'd mirrored back the version of me I most wanted to be seen as, and by the time I understood what was missing under the surface, I was already in too deep. He'd told me he was separated when we met. He was. That part was true. But he'd also never really left his former life, emotionally or practically. And when I got pregnant, unexpectedly, in the way that things happen when 2 people have stopped being careful because they've also stopped paying attention to each other. His first response wasn't surprise. It was calculation. He told me we could figure it out. He told me Maeve would have everything she needed. He said a lot of things that weren't quite lies, but weren't quite the truth either. And I was tired and scared, and I believed him because I needed to. He started pulling away when Maeve was 3 months old, cold in small ways that were hard to name, condescending about decisions I made about her care, critical of how I was handling going back to work, then critical when I decided not to. He'd never hit me. He'd never shouted, not really. He just quietly, methodically made me feel stupid, small, and lucky to have him. And then, he'd told me, one evening in September, that he didn't think this was working. Meaning me. He'd already spoken to a lawyer. I packed what I could while he was at his office the next day. I called Patrick from the car. Here's the thing about the aftermath of something like that. The anger doesn't come right away. First, there's just the practical terror of it. Where do I go? How do I feed my daughter? What does my life look like now? The anger comes later, quietly, when you're doing something ordinary and you suddenly understand the shape of what was done to you. For me, it came on a random Wednesday in November, when Patrick was on a call, and Maeve was napping, and I was reading through a thread on a parenting forum, where women were describing almost exactly what I'd experienced. The gaslighting dressed as concern, the control that looked like helpfulness, the way a certain kind of man finds women at their most vulnerable and presents himself as the solution. I closed the laptop and sat very still for a long time. I brought it up over dinner that night. "How much do you know," I asked Patrick, "about other women he might have done this to? He was quiet in the way that meant he was choosing his words. "I looked into it," he said finally. "After you called from Halifax, I know someone in family law who was able to, quietly, make some inquiries. Patrick, there were 2 other women," he said, "both in situations similar to yours. One settled privately, the other moved away." I set down my fork. "You investigated him. I needed to know what we were dealing with. We, not you, we." I didn't say anything for a long moment. Outside, the first real snowfall of the season was starting. The kind that sticks, that changes the look of everything by morning. "Why didn't you tell me?" He looked at me directly. "Because you needed to feel like you'd landed somewhere safe before you had to deal with any of that. I wasn't going to hand you more weight the second you walked through the door." I thought about my ex-husband sitting in his office in Halifax, completely undisturbed, while I reconstructed my entire life from a condo in Winnipeg. The anger I'd been quietly accumulating sat up straighter in my chest. "I want to know everything," I said. He told me. The pattern was as clear as it was infuriating. A certain type of woman at a vulnerable transition point, a relationship that moved fast and felt like rescue, and then a systematic erosion once the emotional investment was deep enough. Graham had never needed to be dramatic about it. He was the kind of man who understood that slow pressure leaves fewer marks. "What can we do?" I asked. "The woman who settled privately, she might talk to you," Patrick said. "Not legally, but informally. Let you know you're not imagining the pattern. And the other one." He paused. "I think if you were both willing to speak publicly, the story changes." I thought about that for a long time. I'd spent 3 years shrinking, making myself smaller, quieter, less certain of my own observations. The idea of going public, of saying in my own voice exactly what had happened, felt simultaneously terrifying and like the only thing I'd ever really wanted to do. "Not yet," I said. "But maybe." Patrick nodded. "Whenever you're ready." March arrived with that particular Canadian reluctance, still cold. But the light was different, longer, coming through Patrick's kitchen windows at angles that made the whole space feel warmer than it was. Maeve was almost a year old. She'd started pulling herself up on the coffee table and looked personally offended every time her legs refused to cooperate. I'd been working for 4 months. I'd started a small literacy tutoring practice on the side, connecting with local Winnipeg families through a community board posting. It was unofficial and small and mine. I was becoming, in short, someone I recognized again. Which is, I think, why it hit so hard when the email arrived. It came on a Tuesday. Graham, through his lawyer, asserting his intention to seek shared parenting arrangements. The language was formal and bloodless, and every sentence made me want to put my fist through a wall. He'd never once asked about her. Not a single call, not a single message, not one question about whether she was walking yet or what her laugh sounded like. 9 months of silence, and now, suddenly, a lawyer's letter about his paternal rights. I called Patrick from the bathroom while Maeve napped. I kept my voice very level, which is something I do when I'm trying not to fall apart. "He's never asked about her," I said. "Not once. I know." Patrick's voice was calm. "This is about you, not her. He wants to keep leverage edge. Can he?" "Talk to Andrea first." He meant Andrea Fong, the family lawyer he'd quietly introduced me to 2 months earlier, when things had started to feel more stable. Another piece of scaffolding I hadn't known I needed. But I think his case is weak. He voluntarily stepped back. There's documentation, and the timing, filing now after the public inquiry started moving, looks exactly like what it is. The public inquiry had started 2 weeks earlier. The other woman, her name was Simone in public documents, though I won't use it here without her permission, had agreed to speak on record with a journalist. I'd given a background interview. Nothing was printed yet, but Graham apparently knew something was coming. "He's scared," I said. "He should be," Patrick said. I sat on the edge of the bathtub for a long time after we hung up. Through the wall, I could hear Maeve stirring, that particular sound she made, just before she decided sleep was optional. I thought about the version of me from October. Standing in a Shoppers Drug Mart at 11 p.m., too afraid to open a text message, I thought about how impossible it had seemed then that I would ever feel solid again. I got up. I went to get my daughter. The article ran in a national publication on a Thursday morning in April. It was thorough and careful and devastating, in the way that only documented truth can be devastating. It named Graham. It described the pattern across 3 women, 2 of us on record, the third speaking anonymously, and it quoted his own lawyer's letter in a way that made his motives transparent. By afternoon, it was the most read article on the publication's website. I sat with my phone turned face down for most of that day. I knew what was coming, some version of it. But I wasn't prepared for the messages from strangers, women mostly, saying this happened to me too, or I thought I was the only one, or just thank you. I read them in batches, sitting cross-legged on the floor of Patrick's living room with Maeve, asleep in the next room, and I cried in the way that has nothing to do with sadness, the kind that's really just the body, finally letting go of something it's been holding too long. Patrick came home from a site visit around 6, stomped the slush off his boots in the hallway, the way you do in Winnipeg from November through April, and found me sitting on the kitchen floor, with my back against the dishwasher, because at some point the floor had seemed more manageable than the couch. He didn't ask. He just sat down beside me. He withdrew the parenting application, I said. Andrea called an hour ago. Patrick let out a slow breath. It's over, I said. I heard how strange it sounded. I keep saying it to see if it feels real. Does it? Getting there. We sat on the kitchen floor while Maeve slept, and the snow came down outside and the heat clicked on and off in that reliable way of a well-maintained building, and I thought about how much of the last 8 months had been built on Patrick's quiet, consistent presence, the scaffolding that was never scaffolding in his mind, just what you did for someone you loved. That last word caught in my chest. I turned to look at him. Can I ask you something? I said. You can always ask me anything. He said it the same way he'd said everything else, steady, unhurried, like there was no version of this conversation that would alarm him. Why did you have Andrea's number ready? 2 months before I needed it? He looked out at the kitchen, at the bottle rack and the high chair, and the drawings Maeve had done with washable markers on a sheet of paper that was still taped to the fridge. Because I know you, he said, and I knew there'd be a moment when you'd need it. Patrick, I wasn't going to tell you all at once, he said. You needed to find your footing first. But I want to be honest with you now. He met my eyes. I've wanted to say this for a long time. Probably since we were in high school, and I absolutely wasn't mature enough to say it properly. My heart was doing something unreasonable. Say it, I told him. I love you, he said. Simple, like it had always been simple. I've loved you for most of my life. I've watched you choose the wrong people, and I never said anything, because I told myself it wasn't my place. And then you showed up on my doorstep with Maeve, and I thought, I am not going to be quiet about this anymore. I was quiet for a long time. Outside, a car with a bad muffler drove past. Very Winnipeg, very real. I convinced myself, I said slowly, that you felt like home because we'd known each other so long. Maybe that's part of it, but it's not all of it. No, he said, it's not all of it. I thought about every time I'd called him when things were bad, every time he'd picked up, every coffee made exactly right, every piece of careful scaffolding, every moment he'd sat beside me without making me explain. I'm scared, I said honestly. I know, not of you, I gestured vaguely. Of what happens if we try this and it doesn't work and I lose the one person who has never. You won't lose me, he said, not a promise designed to reassure. Just a fact, stated plainly the way he stated most things. I've been your person for 22 years. That doesn't turn off. Maeve woke up then, announced herself at her usual volume. I stood up. Patrick stood up. We went to get her together. No discussion, just both of us moving in the same direction, standing in the doorway of the room that had become her room over the last 8 months. The mobile he'd ordered the week I arrived, the little shelf of board books, the curtains his mother had sent from Calgary in a care package. I understood that this hadn't been a temporary arrangement for a long time. She's going to be so smug about this, I said, watching Maeve rattle the crib rails with gleeful efficiency. Patrick laughed, really laughed, and the sound of it filled up the room. A year and a half later, it snowed on our wedding day, which in Winnipeg in late September is either bad luck or just Tuesday, depending on who you ask. We held it in a community space we'd booked 3 months out. Wooden floors, big windows, 43 people who actually knew and loved us. My sister flew in from Victoria. My mother cried through the entire ceremony and claimed she wasn't crying. Patrick's mother, who had been treating me like a daughter-in-law since approximately month 2, organized the entire reception and refused to let anyone help. Maeve was 2.5, deeply committed to her flower girl duties, and fell asleep in Patrick's arms 20 minutes into the reception, with her dress hiked up and her shoes on the wrong feet, which was exactly how we all would have drawn it up. When I think about the woman standing in that Shoppers at 11 p.m., $43 to her name, afraid to open a text message, I don't feel sorry for her. I feel something more complicated and more tender than that. She was doing the hardest thing, leaving. She didn't know yet that leaving was the beginning of something, not just the end. She just kept moving forward. That was enough.